On today's episode, I explain what Whitney Houston's Bentley coupe could possibly have to do with the rivalry between Orchard Park and Columbia Point. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. So I'm sure almost everybody watching this knows who Bobby Brown is, and especially who Whitney Houston was. Hopefully a lot of people will remember Whitney for her music and talent instead of her unfortunate downward slide. I think it's kind of impossible not to think about the turbulent times when discussing this couple, though. In regards to the videos that I usually make, there is a link between these two in the Boston streets. Especially so for Bobby Brown, who grew up in the Orchard Park projects, one of Boston's most dangerous and feared public housing projects. Even as Brown became a superstar in his own right, he maintained a close contact within the Boston streets. Maybe some of you will remember this event, but to some of you this might be new information. At the time, it must have been a top news headline considering Whitney Houston was one of the biggest pop stars in the entire world when it happened. I hope you guys enjoy this quick video about the incident that had far-reaching implications in the Boston streets. Now this video is shorter than my usual videos because this is kind of like a little midweek bonus. I got a few days off. The clam flats are closed for a few days due to a rain closure. I'm still going to do my best to put out my usual video this weekend like I always do. And I was going to put this particular story into a larger video in the future, but I figured it was a big enough headline that I could make a decent short video on it alone. Please don't think by any means that I'm trying to present an in-depth story about Bobby Brown or New Edition or Bobby or Whitney or anything else like that. I'm simply trying to tell an entertaining story that involved two pop superstars in a legendary Boston rivalry. So with that being said, Bobby Brown grew up in the tough Orchard Park projects in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. In 1978, 5 friends, including Brown, formed an R&B group called New Edition. With fellow Roxbury natives Michael Bivins, Ricky Bell, Ronnie DeVoe, and Ralph Tresvant, they began playing any auditorium or venue that they could find. Eventually, in the early 80s, they would begin to pick up momentum and popularity inside the city and outside as well. Roxbury's New Edition would go on to become the prototype for the R&B/boy bands of the late 80s, 90s, and beyond. The new kids on the block who came out almost a decade later who achieved huge levels of success might not have existed if New Edition hadn't forged a trail before them. By the mid-1980s, though, Bobby Brown was getting tired of the squeaky clean image that New Edition used to push their almost bubble pop music on a young female audience. Bobby, who had a sharper image to him, wanted to live the bad boy persona. After internal fighting in the band and lots of personal issues, Bobby was voted out in December of 1989. He would go on to pursue his solo career, and after having some early struggles, barely achieving a gold record, in 1988 Bobby hooked up with legendary producer and singer Teddy Riley, who later formed Blackstreet. Man, I love Blackstreet. The two came out with the smash hit My Prerogative, which stayed #1 through a large part of 1988 and through 1989, kicking Poison's Every Rose Has Its Thorn out of the top spot. Bobby Brown's album Don't Be Cruel sold over 5 million copies in the end of 1988 alone. This made Bobby a bona fide superstar in his own right. So when Bobby accidentally bumped into Whitney Houston at the 1989 Soul Train Awards, he was at the top of his game. Whitney soon after invited Bobby to her birthday party. They developed a quick friendship that turned into a romance, and then in 1991 Bobby proposed to her. Bobby had children out of wedlock, but Houston had no children of her own. I guess there were rumors surrounding her if she even liked men. She had never been seen publicly dating someone, and for a while she lived with a close female childhood friend. So I'm sure even though Bobby had a bad boy image, a marriage to him would help Whitney's public profile. The two were married at Whitney's huge New Jersey estate. Houston was 6 years older than Brown. She was 29 to his 23 years. He was only 20 when they first met. By 1990, Whitney was worth over $50 million, which would probably today be close to $1 billion. And this was before she released the Bodyguard soundtrack, her biggest hit of all. While Bobby Brown was on his come-up, so was a young player from Dorchester named Stephen Seeley. Right around the same time Bobby was grinding away at the music game, trying to get New Edition off the ground, Seeley was grinding the streets of Dorchester around the Columbia Point projects. Now, I briefly mentioned this a few videos back about Detroit having an influence in Boston that I wasn't aware of before. Apparently, a man named Dwayne Wonderful Wayne Davis was trying to set up a beachhead in Boston. Davis originally was a member of YBI, or Young Boys Incorporated, from Detroit. He then started his own splinter group called the H2O Crew. Without going into crazy detail, because I think I want to talk about this stuff more in depth in a later video, but Young Boys Inc. were well known for rocking Adidas top 10s way back in the 70s, so I'm just a little curious if they influenced Boston's love for Adidas at all. Either way, by the late 70s, Detroit was an incredibly saturated market, maybe second only to Harlem. So these groups were branching out to other cities with less competition, like Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Seattle, and yes, Boston, Massachusetts. When Wonderful Wayne Davis came to Boston, he apparently made some sort of beachhead in or around the dangerous Columbia Point projects. It was said that he could get $60 for the same item in Boston that he'd only get $10 for in Detroit. Now, it doesn't take some sort of math genius to figure out the attraction there. A teenage Stephen Seeley in 1981 started working for Davis as a driver and a bodyguard. He quickly gained favor and trust from his boss, who helped him set up his own satellite spot in Columbia Point. In September of 1982, Seeley, among others, accompanied Davis back to Detroit to settle some business there. The product was still coming from Detroit and then being parceled off to the satellite cities. I'm sure that the huge profits that Davis was making made his associates in Detroit jealous. Either way, on September 28, 1982, while driving in northwest Detroit, they were attacked and Davis did not make it. Seeley would return to Boston without his former boss and set out to get back into the game. This is part that I'd rather not talk about too much either because I want to talk about it in later videos, and honestly, I have more questions than answers. Basically what I'm trying to get at is I want to do a more in-depth video later about this time period from the early to mid-80s when a lot of these crews were first forming. I'd rather get more in-depth information from people with first-hand knowledge instead of just speculating. Regardless, by the late 80s, a new and incredibly lucrative product had come out on the market, and different groups were squabbling with each other over territory and proceeds. Darryl Whiting, aka God, and his New York boys came into Bobby Brown's native Orchard Park in the late 80s and set up a small beachhead. After initially having problems with the local trailblazers, Whiting and the local crew came to an agreement. Eventually, Orchard Park became a hub making close to $100,000 a day. In 1991, the federal government came after Whiting with all of their might. He ended up going away for life. Other crews from around the city started eyeing OP's huge market. One such group was allegedly the one that Stephen Seeley was a member of, the Columbia Point Dogs. All the events that I'm talking about happened over 30 years ago, but I have to say that the Orchard Park Trailblazers and the Columbia Point Dogs are one of the longest running and bitter rivalries in Boston inner city history, and it continues on to this very day. While Seeley was trying to get his piece of the pie in Boston, he became acquainted with none other than R&B superstar and Boston native Bobby Brown. Seeley, who I'm sure was a player in the day and presented himself as such, struck up a romance with Brown's sister Carol. As the two became more deeply involved, Seeley and Brown began to hang out with each other. In 1993, Seeley was picked up on a weapons charge, pled guilty, and was sentenced to 2 years. Now, I'm not sure if it was during his incarceration or directly after, but upon his release, he was engaged to Bobby's sister Carol. Bobby flew Seeley down to Atlanta, where he was currently living. Liking Seeley and knowing his background on the street, Bobby gave him a legitimate employment as a bodyguard and a driver. It's alleged that even though Seeley was about to marry into some money, plus the fact that he was on Bobby Brown's legitimate payroll, it seems that Seeley was still very much in the streets. Apparently, he was a factor in the escalating conflict between the Orchard Park Trailblazers and the Columbia Point Dogs. It's alleged that Seeley ordered stash houses of the Trailblazers to be targeted and robbed by the Dogs. The loss of revenue plus the blatant disrespect would definitely be more than enough to trigger retaliation by the Trailblazers. So in September of 1995, when Seeley and Brown were back in Boston, cruising around going to different nightclubs, they were on dangerous ground. Seeley, being from Columbia Point, would have to be extra cautious considering they had multiple rivals throughout the city. Whether Brown was aware of how dangerous the environment was in Boston for them at the time or not, I'm not completely sure. He might have been so out of his mind with his own issues that he simply might not have been paying enough attention. So just a tiny bit of pretext. By 1995, Bobby Brown and Whitney were world famous. Whitney was obviously more famous and rich than Bobby, but he was a star in his own right, and he was certainly a legend in Boston. By 95, Brown was well on his way down the dark journey of addiction, as I'm sure Whitney was as well. Brown claims Whitney was doing this well before he met her. After her smash hit on the Bodyguard soundtrack, which she also starred in across from Kevin Costner, catapulted Whitney to a new stratosphere of fame. I'm not sure if this caused a rift between the two, her success and his downward trending career. But none of this really mattered when it came to the events of September 28, 1995. But I just wanted to paint a picture that when this did transpire, it was at the height of their fame, before the sad and mostly public unraveling of the two. On the night of September 25th, 1995, Brown and a small entourage, including Seeley, stopped at the Biarritz Lounge on 175 Dudley Street in Roxbury, which was literally right around the corner from Brown's home of Orchard Park. Now, for Brown, this was probably a good time, to be going around his old stomping ground, showing off a little bit of his fame and fortune. And on this particular night, they were driving around in Whitney's $375,000 cream-colored Bentley coupe. It's not like today where it's almost common to see luxury cars like Ferraris and Bentleys and Rolls Royces. Back in the 90s, Bentleys were pretty rare, especially in Roxbury. It was definitely a statement for Brown to be cruising around in this elegant machine. He felt safe. He had his future brother-in-law who was feared on the Boston streets, along with at least one other armed bodyguard. While this might have been home turf for Brown, it was anything but friendly for Seeley. While the Columbia Point dogs weren't welcome in a lot of neighborhoods, the bad blood was especially thick with Orchard Park. I would assume being this close proximity to OP, no matter who he was with, would make Seeley nervous. Plus the fact that they pulled up in a loud Bentley that was worth almost $500,000 certainly announced their presence. Now, it's really no surprise to me that while Brown, Seeley, and the others were inside the bar, guys outside from OP had marked the Bentley. Bobby Brown was from Orchard Park. His mother still lived there, so he might have even driven into the projects with the Bentley. But at the very least, the Trailblazer members would have known who it belonged to. So around 1 a.m., Brown and his entourage exited the lounge, and a few people outside asked for autographs, to which Bobby obliged happily. After he got into the Bentley's driver's seat with future brother-in-law Stephen Seeley seated next to him in the passenger seat, right before Brown pulled away from the curb, a man approached the side of the car and opened up on Seeley, hitting him 3 times in the chest and head. Then he reached in and snatched Seeley's large gold chain and medallion before running off into the direction of the Orchard Park projects. Bobby was not hit. He ducked underneath the steering wheel and survived unscathed. His other bodyguard returned a volley but missed his target. Seeley was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead 5 hours later. The authorities detained a distraught Brown for questioning. There's live footage of the aftermath. You can find it online if you dig enough. The police combed the Orchard Park housing projects looking for a suspect, but it was later discovered that the perpetrator jumped into a waiting car that fled the scene. Later arrested and convicted were John Tibbs of the actual crime and Cedric Cookie Phillips as the getaway driver. The authorities originally thought it was a robbery, but later changed the motive to revenge, for Seeley ordering people to rob stash houses at OP as part of the Trailblazers and Columbia Point Dogs' ongoing feud. This is just a small chapter in one of Boston's most bitter and epic rivalries. It's definitely one of the most notable events of the feud, though, considering it took place in a worldwide superstar's almost $400,000 luxury sedan, in the middle of one of Boston's most dangerous hoods as well. This would just be one of major tragic debacles that would follow Bobby Brown throughout his life and career. Whitney and Bobby's story ultimately was a tragedy, one that should be heeded by younger generations. Substances which can at first seem like a quick fix lead to a long road of destruction in the end. I can almost guarantee that if Whitney were here today, she would most certainly say that using is never the answer. I hope you guys enjoyed this quick video about a memorable incident in Boston's past that included some very famous people from Boston and beyond. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Most importantly, guys, make good choices, good decisions, take care of yourself, your friends, your family, your fellow human beings. Try to have a nice day, and I'll talk to you guys soon. God bless.